Okay, welcome back to round three. This is probably going to be a short one here, but we're going to talk about some medieval literature. So we talked a little bit about medieval drama coming out of the towns, not drama in the sense of like social problems, more, drama in the sense of plays, performances. That was one type of medieval literature. And, probably the one that the most people were exposed to because it was part of the popular culture for that even peasants had access to. But there's also many other forms of medieval literature and sort of writing as well. I guess, we rarely in classes like this define what we mean by literature, but literature includes both, fictional writing and sort of nonfiction writing. So works of writing in general are the idea that we try and get across with when we say literature. So let's talk about some of the other different types of writing in this time period. So in a time period where God is so important, we're going to talk about that more with the church. You can imagine that a lot of the writing would connect to ideas of God. And absolutely, this is the case. The monks and nuns and abbots are the types of people who have the most knowledge of writing and the strongest connections to God officially. Oftentimes they are in contact with the official head of the Roman Catholic Church back in Rome, or they may see themselves as less under the authority of Rome, but still on some level they've got to answer to the Pope. But the places like monasteries are the places where we see a lot of writing coming out. Sometimes the monks are compiling things that are like lists of miraculous events that happened, or stories of the lives of saints, and we do have a lot of that writing still today. And as I said, they do play a significant role in preserving some of the Greek and Roman knowledge as well. And at the same time, they're coming up with new stuff. And one person I really want to mention is Hildegard von Bingen. And she is a significant female figure in medieval literature. She was a mystic. She had visions. Now, we don't know exactly all the details about these visions, but we do have the story of her life as she told it, and how she first found herself having these visions sent from God. And there was a debate sometimes as to whether visions were, being possessed by a devil or messages sent from God. But Hildegard managed to make the case, the persuasive case, that these visions were from God and that they carried important messages from God. And in part because of this, in part because of the social position she was in, she managed to be the abbess of an abbey. A Benedictine abbey, the Benedictine order being a sort of subgroup within the Roman Catholic tradition. And her life is a good showing of the fact that a lot of times when women rose to positions of power in the medieval world, it was usually because of some particular religious reason. That was a way in which they could claim authority, because nobody is more of an authority on Hildegard's visions than Hildegard herself. Men aren't able, they try in her life story, but they ultimately aren't able to get her to stop having visions. And she could sort of rally people around her towards the idea of God, which was something that everybody approved of. And we're going to talk a little bit later on, especially as we get to the Renaissance, about this idea of wanting to investigate nature versus wanting to just sort of leave nature to God. But Hildegard was someone who advocated understanding God's creation and saying we should understand nature. So she was, in a way, a kind of scientist, and promoted other people being scientists as well. And she used her position as an abbess to do so. She was also the composer of music, some of which we will have the chance to listen to on Monday. So yeah, she's pretty cool, and her visions are pretty wild, as you can see from the images we have over here. You got to imagine that she was able to encourage other women as nuns to use their religious authority in a certain way as well. Now, they were still ultimately subject to men, particularly the Pope, but they could carve out a niche for themselves and maybe a bit freer than women whose lives were just to get married. So we've got the religious literature. We've also got the literature of the feudal system, particularly of the idea of knights. Knights or nobles, they have more money than the peasants. So they are the ones who are going to be able to do a lot more writing. And we see themes of fealty, which is this idea of loyalty, right? Loyalty to the king in a lot of medieval literature. And I think I mentioned this, the story of the Song of Roland. Roland originally was a loyal vassal to Charlemagne. He was a real person, we're pretty sure. But the stories around him got to be on kind of like a, King Arthur level, and of him being this loyal knight. And the moral of his story basically is the nobility of him dying for God and for his king. The story of the Song of Roland is based on this, we're pretty sure, real historical event where a bunch of Charlemagne's forces fought a bunch of Muslim forces at the Gate of Spain, as they called it. This was a real event, an ambush that took place in 778. But here it's turned into a giant dramatic story. And Roland is noble because he goes out, he sacrifices himself for his king, and he sacrifices himself for God, fighting to, bring the Christian tradition by force to the Muslim part of the world, because Spain was still Muslim at this time. Now, the events took place in the 700s, but the story was written in the thousands, around 1064, and reflect a lot more of the ideas of 1064 than they do the ideas of the 700s. I don't know if that was Charlemagne's motivation when he fought the Muslims in Spain. It might have been just to try and expand his territory. But here it becomes something about God, and also equally importantly, becomes something about fealty. Roland becomes the model of loyalty. If you're a knight, you want to be a knight like Roland and be loyal to your king. That's the kind of ideals that these vassals, these nobles would tell each other. There are also a lot of other stories that were sort of part of the culture of the aristocrats as well. There was a lot of stuff about, the nobility of war, the glory of battle, and stuff like that. There were poems written about, how glorious it is to be a warrior, stuff like that. So that's an important genre as well. But maybe the most interesting and maybe the most lasting from our perspective is medieval writing about love. And it's a strange kind of love that we may or may not recognize. I'll be curious to see what you guys think. So this is the tradition of courtly love or courtly romance. And these are usually stories being told by men and women of, oops, I meant to write noble there. I wrote loyal, but noble birth. And so this is, again, stories told by aristocrats, by knights, and by the women who are part of that sort of knightly class. And it is about women and men who are unable to be together, because the knight might want to be married to a particular woman, and a woman might want to be married to a particular knight, but this is a time period of a lot of arranged marriages, a lot of political alliances. That's just not going to happen. So what happens instead is that a knight pledges his loyalty to a particular lady. He's not necessarily going to be in a relationship with her, but he's going to pledge that he is her knight. He is her special knight. And when he wins battles, he's doing it for her, and he's doing it to bring glory to her name. And he may carry like her handkerchief tied onto his lance or something like that to show that he has the lady's favor. That's a very special thing. It represents something very bright and shining and heroic. Now, were these people supposed to be romantically interested in each other? Well, in theory, this was supposed to be a chase thing. The knight was not supposed to be adulterous, and neither was the lady. They were supposed to, stay in their own positions. But a lot of people wonder if this sort of tradition of praising your noble lady wasn't cover for a lot of adultery, in fact. A way of expressing a love affair without really, without saying it outright, saying, oh no, I'm not seeing the lady behind the king's back. I am just saying how great and how wonderful she is. There was a way you could do that, and so you could kind of get away with it. That's the theory anyway. And there's this theme of love versus duty, love versus the duty of marriage, because marriage was not something you controlled, yet it was supposed to be very important. And so a lot of poems and stories emerged as part of this process of praising the noble ladies, um, wherein the lady was sort of celebrated, or stories about other knights and noble ladies were told. And these stories were told by troubadours. These were musicians and performers who would write poems and sing songs about this kind of love between the lady and the noble knight. And again, these were people who were noble themselves. That became their gig, was being musicians. Um, uh, there isn't a huge difference between poems and songs in this time period anyway. The lines kind of blurred there, because you could set poems to music and you could turn songs into poems. And so over time, we go from poems about love to stories about love, telling these stories of these knights and their ladies. And again, in the stories, it's theoretically a chaste relationship, but it's not necessarily always 100% the case. And interestingly, these love songs were most popular among women. And historians have thought maybe this was a way of expressing, a greater degree of freedom, or a kind of fantasizing about what life could be if you were with the person of your choice, or at least a way to sort of celebrate the people you actually liked and not your husband, who you might not actually like at all. That's the theory anyway. And it certainly seems to be the case that women celebrated these songs and enjoyed them quite a lot. They were in a way comparable to, romantic novels. But to get into the actual stories a little bit more, this brings us kind of into the theme of King Arthur. So King Arthur, his stories are a big part of the medieval culture as well. They're even more popular after the medieval period, honestly. But in medieval culture, what they kind of express is the ideal of fealty, of loyalty. But at the same time, they also explore these themes of this courtly love, the love that takes place at the royal court. And in part, they do this through the character of Lancelot. Now, Lancelot is a flawed hero. He is King Arthur's best knight, arguably. He is a great monster slayer, and he is one of the most noble people in the world. But he betrays King Arthur because, and this is confirmed in the story, he does sleep with the queen. He betrays King Arthur by committing adultery with the queen, and the queen betrays King Arthur. And so in some stories, this is seen as, Lancelot's tragic flaw, the reason why he could not find the Holy Grail, whereas his son, who had not committed that particular sin, could. And there are other themes in Lancelot's story of he thinks he's sleeping with Guinevere, and then he's actually sleeping with someone else. So it's a whole thing. It's a whole pattern with him, this pattern of adultery. And the question a lot of people have wondered is this a parody of the idea of courtly love, like saying, well, if you have this sort of knight and lady relationship, then obviously that's going to devolve into something sexual? Or is it a way of saying, yes, and that's good, it's beautiful and it's noble, and what we're really trying to express with these poems is how lovely it is to have this kind of interaction? It's hard to say for sure, but one thing we do know is that Lancelot and Guinevere did feature in a lot of these poems. Another figure who featured in a lot of these poems was Tristan. In some stories, he was said to be a knight of King Arthur's court, but in other stories, in earlier stories, he seems to have been a separate entity. But there's a story of him falling in love with Isolde, a young princess named Isolde. So Isolde was betrothed to a much older king, which was, we got to imagine, not uncommon, King Mark. So King Mark is this great king, and then he's going to get married to Isolde, and then his nephew Tristan comes along and accidentally drinks a love potion with Isolde. They're both really thirsty, and they reach for a drink, and they're like, oh no, we drank the love potion by mistake. And the love potion was supposed to make Isolde fall in love with Mark so that everything would work out, but instead, the young people fall in love instead. And so this seems like a really convenient excuse, right? Like, oh, we couldn't help being in love. We drank the love potion. And I think a lot of people would identify with this, especially, say, if you were a young man who was interested in a young woman, but the king was going to marry the young woman instead. You might find that really relatable. And so again, in that story, there's that tension between like, how much is this endorsed by the story? It honestly probably depends on which version of the story you are going for. In some versions of the story, it's, love is all important. In other versions of the story, it's like, man, these guys really made a mistake, didn't they? But eventually they both die. But later on, they appear in Dante's Inferno, and Dante sees them in hell. They're being punished for adultery by being in hell. And they say, yeah, it was worth it. So that's quite a theme right there, the idea of love being worth it, even if you go to hell. That's kind of one of the tensions of this society. What are the opportunities for love? What are the opportunities for freedom versus the sort of strict social structures and the strict ideals that will condemn many people to hell? And speaking of Dante, he is the last figure I want to focus on for medieval literature. Now, admittedly, he's pretty late. Arguably, some people have called him Renaissance literature as well, but it's a question of whether you want to put the 1300s in there. He comes to define a lot of ideas that were sort of simmering around during the Middle Ages, but hadn't really been nailed down 100%, because he basically gives a story of visiting hell, purgatory, and heaven in that order. So his story is an epic poem, which is remarkable for a variety of reasons. First off, it's bringing back epic poems like we had with Beowulf and with ancient stuff like the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Aeneid. All those ancient ones were kind of swirling around in his head as he was writing this. Today we read it as prose, but it's important to remember it was originally a poem, which could be, if one wished, set to music. And what is the story of this epic poem? Well, really, it's 3 poems in a giant sequence. It's quite colossal. And the 3 poems are Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, describing each of the different sort of realms of existence as the church understood it at that time, and as Dante interpreted it. And the fun thing about it is it is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of fan fiction of all the sort of stuff, all the older epic poems from Greek and Roman times. Dante meets a lot of mythological characters in his journey, and he meets a lot of, he sort of models it after journeys to the underworld in Greek mythology that we see in those older works. So he is really writing Odyssey, Iliad, Aeneid fan fiction. And it's even better than that. It's self-insert fan fiction because he makes himself the main character of the story. The main character of the story is Dante himself. And who does he meet? Why, he meets the author of his favorite Roman poem, who is Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, which also has a journey to the underworld. So that's his guide as he goes to the underworld, is his favorite author. And in hell, who does he see? Well, guess what? He sees all his enemies, the people who are hating his work and trying to destroy him and things like that. People he just personally doesn't like, he puts them in hell. So that's pretty great. You gotta love that. And that might be part of why Inferno is the most famous of the 3 works, to the point where people will speak of Dante's Inferno. But altogether, they form one sort of continuous work, which is called the Divine Comedy. Now, we shouldn't think of comedy as like, ha-ha, funny jokes. We should think of it more as like happy endings, because there's comedy and tragedy. Do you have happy endings as in comedy, or tragic endings as in tragedy? So Dante is saying ultimately this is a triumphant story, because ultimately he learns about how people can go to heaven, and he ends up in heaven and he sees heaven. So that's kind of the human journey, is from hell to heaven. And so he sees that whole process taking place. And the other reason that we keep coming back to the Inferno especially is that he really came to define people's images of hell. His idea of this place where there's a lot of fire and a lot of burning, a large part of that is based on him. The idea of there being 9 circles of hell, that also goes back to Dante. A lot of other things like that come back to Dante. So he took ideas and he added his own zest to it, and he made something that was popular enough that it influenced the way people thought about their own religion. That's pretty successful thing for a fan fiction to do. And the thing is, he had no basis for a lot of it. He would just sort of like, yeah, this seems cool, and reminds me of ancient stories that I really like. So that's kind of fun. And it is kind of moving in a lot of ways that, you know, he goes all the way to heaven and he sees the face of God. That's a pretty cool story. And that is definitely one that would have been popular with people coming out of the Middle Ages. All right. So yeah, so we've covered a lot of different things. Hopefully, you know, not overloading you guys here. I know there's always a lot to process when we're talking about all this stuff. But next time we are going to focus in on the church and on this crisis period in the church. And we'll finally get to listen to a little bit of medieval music as well. So I will see you guys for that one on Monday. But in the meantime, I'm going to leave you with a discussion question. I think I'm going to give you the choice of 2 discussion questions. You can write about the feudal system or about the Vikings. So I look forward to seeing your answers for either of those. And yeah, take care.